Professor Eliot Cohen, welcome to the Dispatch podcast.
It's good to be with you.
I hope I can still call you professor. I know that from your articles you are leaving academia, but I will continue to call you professor in this podcast. But I wanted to have you on after reading a recent Atlantic piece that you wrote, your most recent one in the Atlantic, entitled "Cancel the Foreign Policy Apocalypse." In part because you articulated something that I have been thinking in a much better way that I could put it on paper, both foreign policy, and then we'll get to it later, slightly on what maybe the downsides domestically might be. But you write in the article, as hard as I find to admit, it is possible that things may be less bad than they seem. Despite the warnings, a second Trump term may not be a riot of alliance-shattering isolationism, bellicose warmongering, or catastrophically stupid diplomacy. Explain what you mean, Professor. And just to, as listeners will probably know, you're not necessarily a Trump supporter at all. You're one of the original never Trumpers. So coming from you, it is perhaps shocking to see for some readers to say that maybe this won't be as bad as the worst case scenario might seem.
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, if you want to call me professor, that's fine. I'm a professor emeritus, so it really doesn't make any difference at all. So the first thing I have to say, I'm really, I guess I was not surprised by the reaction to the piece among my never Trump friends, but still, there's just people are not particularly careful readers, I find. So if you look at the article, it says I am a unrepentant, unapologetic never Trumper, always was, always will be. I say I'm not going to talk about the domestic policy issues where I think the dangers are quite real. And, in the part that you quoted, there's a lot of may, could be, not as bad. So, all I'm asking people to do is to consider the possibility that things may, repeat, may not be, necessarily apocalyptic. And we'll talk in a moment about the particular reasons why I feel that about foreign policy. But, given the temper of the times, I think there is something to be said for telling people to get a grip. There is something about Trump that causes most of us, myself too, from time to time, to get downright hysterical that this is the end of the republic. It's not. It could potentially be very bad, and he could do a lot of damage both domestically and internationally. But I think it's also extremely important that people understand and learn to live with the contingent in politics, the way accidents of personality can affect things, and the possibility that the people or crowd of people that you're dealing with may be a little bit more complicated than you think. That's really all there is to it. To lay out the basic argument, the reason why I think it may not be a complete disaster is, first, if you look at the platform, if actually you look at his speech, even if you look at JD Vance's speech, there's nothing in there to suggest really all-out kind of Robert Taft-style isolationism. There's the standard America First stuff, but in the platform and in the speeches, I don't really see that. Secondly, if you look particularly at the recent aid package to Ukraine, that was done by somebody who I think most people would think of as a MAGA Republican, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, and it was done with Trump's approval. Johnson went to Mar-a-Lago and basically got him on board. And then I think there are reasons why, again, it may not be as bad as you might think. And that has to do with the question of who's going to surround Donald Trump. If it is Tom Cotton and Mike Pompeo, I worry a lot less. If it's people like some of the crazies, Mike Flynn, Kash Patel, and others, I worry quite a bit. And finally, there's a lot we don't really know about Trump himself. We don't know how he's going to be affected by something that shapes all presidents in their second terms, That is to say, they're the way they begin thinking about themselves from the point of view of history with a capital H. We don't know really how he's been affected psychologically by having a near-death experience in that attempted assassination. We don't know what the internal politics of a new administration are going to be. We don't know the impact of how the fact that foreign leaders, including democratic leaders, have learned how to deal with him. I mean, the fact that Boris Johnson has an hour with him during a convention, and as Johnson made it pretty clear, to talk about Ukraine, that says something. What does all of it amount to? I don't know. But in a way, that's my point. Nobody does. And so we should hold off on the hysterics until we have good reason for them.
Out of curiosity, what was your assessment of his foreign policy during his first term?
So I think he toyed with some very dangerous things. He does have this very transactional view, particularly of NATO, as something like a protection racket. But for whatever reason, and it was a combination of the people around him breaking him, deceiving him in some cases, manipulating him in others, the rhetoric was terrible. But in terms of the damage he actually did to NATO, I don't really think there was a lot. And there was something that was positive, and I hate to say it, but remains positive, in scaring the Europeans into increasing their own defense spending and contemplating the possibility that they simply cannot rely exclusively on the United States to protect them, that they're going to have to make strenuous efforts. If you look at the policy towards China, and again, a point that I make in the article is there's always a lot more continuity in American foreign policy than people would like to admit between different kinds of administrations. Honestly, I mean, the Biden administration is following pretty much the same line on China, both certainly militarily, but also, I would say, in terms of trade policy. That is to say, trying to decrease our reliance on Chinese supply chains. So a lot of stuff that's similar. I would argue, both administrations have neglected Latin America. That's a longstanding American fault. The big difference is Trump, I think, was quite sincere about wanting to control the border. I don't think the Biden people have been particularly interested in it. So, when you add it all up, do I have tremendous reservations about what they actually did as opposed to how they talked? Yeah, some, but, say, take the Middle East. I was against the JCPOA deal with Iran, but I also think it was a terrible idea to simply pull out of it and not replace it with something. To his credit, he ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which I think was worth doing. They did broker the Abraham Accords, or at least played an important role. I mean, the locals, UAE and Israel, deserve most of the credit for that. But, was the policy a disastrous one? I can't really say that it was. Now, that doesn't guarantee anything. And I want to insist, it is entirely conceivable that they will do some awful things, and, of which the worst would be to blow up NATO. I'm just saying, you look at the actual record, for whatever reasons, it was not as bad as you might think.
You do mention in the piece, you write, the biggest potential outlier on this list of commitments is Europe, and specifically NATO. And I know that John Bolton, his former national security advisor, who, let's say, is estranged from the Trump world these days, believes that Trump's instinct is to, not just threaten to pull out NATO, to have NATO put more money into its own defense or build up the individual countries' defense budgets, but to actually pull out of NATO. What do you think the likelihood or potential of that is, and what would the consequences of that be?
Well, I do think it is his instinct. Whether it's an instinct that he gives way to will depend on a whole bunch of things. Again, who's around him, whether it's the Tom Cottons or the Mike Pompeos. I think one of the things is that we realize with Trump is he finds it very hard to deal with the expert and technocratic class. And John Bolton is sort of at the margins of that, but that's basically what he's part of. He finds it easier to deal with the political people who happen to have, technical expertise, which would be the Tom Cottons and the Pompeos. I think he does view alliances as kind of a protection racket, but I also think he likes to talk big as a way of gaining leverage. That's been part of his MO. Would he really want to blow it up if he thought, or people were told him, this will destroy your legacy? No, I mean he's going to be obsessed with what his legacy is going to be, and I think that may induce a certain amount of caution. If he did it, and it's conceivable, it would be a disaster. It would, for the moment, increase Russian influence and control in Europe immensely. It might very well lead to further wars, because I think the Russians would like to gobble the Baltics back up. I think in a somewhat longer run, it means the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I think if NATO falls apart, particularly because of what we have done, the only logical thing for every country from Finland to Poland to Turkey to Kazakhstan is to acquire nuclear weapons. And if that happens, you're going to get a cascade of nuclear proliferation around the world. And at a certain point, if you have, instead of half a dozen or so countries having nuclear weapons, you have 20 or 30 or 40, it's only a matter of time before somebody uses one.
Well, let me ask you about some recent foreign policy comments that Trump made just days ago in an interview that was released by Bloomberg, which may be another outlier on Taiwan. He told the interviewers, look, a couple of things. Number one, Taiwan, I know the people very well, respect them greatly. They did take about 100% of our chip business. I think Taiwan should pay for us for our defense. We're no different than an insurance company. Taiwan doesn't give us anything. Taiwan is 9,500 miles away. It's 68 miles away from China, a slight advantage, and China's a massive piece of land. They could just bombard it. In one sense, it's what you said with NATO, that this could be a negotiating position. But the fact that he is kind of suggesting that this is much more important to China, it's closer to China. Could you envision Trump not seeing the threat of war with China, or a potential war or conflict with China worth it, and trying to come to some sort of deal that would bring back Taiwan into China in some way? Maybe like the 50-year plan to allow, like they had with Hong Kong, which China violated, to bring Taiwan back into China's orbit. I mean, is that an imaginable scenario to you?
It's imaginable that, but the thing that's dangerous is there are a lot of American business leaders who feel that way. There are a lot of American liberals who feel that way. This is not just a Trump problem; it's a broader problem. And I completely agree with that. Now, again, it depends on who his advisors are is going to matter. So his China expert on the NSC was Matthew Pottinger, who may or may not play a role in the next, if Trump is elected. Pottinger's a China hawk, and Pottinger will understand that. Also, let's remember, too, Trump, I mean, he's an incurious man. He's not a well-read man. He's not a guy who actually follows foreign policy. He entered the administration extremely hostile to the Japanese, and I suspect that that's because somewhere in the recesses of his mind, he remembers in the 1980s, Ezra Vogel's Japan is number one, and the Japanese are eating us alive. By the end of his administration, he actually had a reasonable relationship with the Japanese. So I think, his starting position is one of ignorance and belligerence and transactionalism. Whether he ends up that way, again, I would just say we don't know. I mean, I just want to insist. I'm saying we don't know. I'm not saying it will be okay. I'm just saying we don't know.
For those who are, as you said, there are some people who don't understand why. I mean, just explain, in your view, strategically, why America should support Taiwan in case of a conflict. And I would presume this would be potentially a nuclear conflict when you enter a conflict with China. What is it? What is the risk of America losing, or Taiwan being subsumed by China and America not doing anything?
Okay, so let me set aside for the moment the fact that Taiwan is a thriving democracy. To have a democracy, a substantial thriving democracy, wiped out by a authoritarian, semi-totalitarian aggressor is a very bad thing for liberal democracy around the world. And that's one of the reasons why we should care about Ukraine as well, by the way. And this was something that Americans came to understand after World War II. Let's say those arguments don't convince you, although they should certainly weigh with you. There are a couple of things. One is the Taiwanese economy is what, the 17th or 20th, something like that, largest in the world. This is a substantial economy. It is the world's chip manufacturer. Trump is sort of right on that one. For that asset to fall into Chinese hands is a big deal. It's also a big deal if they have that island, not only with its resources of people and high technology, but just its physical position and the danger that it then poses for Japan and other countries. Furthermore, if after everything we have done and said about Taiwan, we let it slip into the hands of China, then there again, I think either the local Asian powers simply make their peace with China and accommodate it as the hegemon, or equally likely, I think in the case of Japan and possibly Australia, they say, okay, we got to get nuclear weapons. And I think that's not a world that we want. I mean, we are just not used to the idea that you could have a cascade of nuclear proliferation and what that might mean. And I just think people they don't take it seriously enough, and they don't pause to consider what are the implications. But I mean, let me just finish with this. If you give up on Taiwan after, and certainly if the administration were to give up on Ukraine as well, I mean, America's word will be mud. And what people don't understand is that so much of our power in the world and our ability to set the rules and our ability to create a world order that benefits us, which isn't something that Trump always understands, is because of our alliance systems. And to jeopardize those is to do tremendous damage to the United States as well as the rest of the world.
Professor, I know that you believe that the Biden administration should have done more and helped Ukraine more than it has, or allowed them to do more to fight the Russians. But given that they didn't, I wonder if you think the U.S. would actually come and do the types of things that you think are necessary to defend Taiwan in that situation if China invaded. And if not, if it was going to be like Ukraine, where they're going to give some weapons but not, allow for total victory, or not give enough to have total victory, and ultimately settle for some truce where Russia gets some of the territory. Should we not tell Taiwan that beforehand to have them make their decision? If they think that we're going to be have their back in a significant way, and the reality is President Trump wouldn't, and maybe Joe Biden wouldn't do what they think is going to happen, shouldn't they have that knowledge to make a decision whether they really want to risk a major war with China?
So the geography of the two countries matters. The fact that Ukraine is a land war, this would be a naval conflict of some kind. An amphibious assault would be very, very difficult. I think the more likely scenario is the Chinese play things differently than the Russians did. I think it'd be more a question of blockade, harassment, that sort of thing. So the measures that would be required are very different. I mean, you're onto something in that we've got the Taiwan that we've created over the last 50 years, where we have basically told the Taiwanese, shut up, sit in a corner, don't disturb anybody, and you can get on with your lives. Under those conditions, it's not surprising that they don't all have those New Hampshire license plates that say live free or die. I mean, if they cannot be sure that we will show up, then, why should they be prepared to die to the last man or woman? Now, we are gradually doing things, but we could be doing a lot more. So, for example, we now have American military personnel on the island who are doing kind of regular training, assisting the Taiwanese in training. We don't let them wear uniforms in public. We should stop that. We should let them wear uniforms in public so that people know we're there. We do not really exercise together with the Taiwanese military. We train them to some extent or do some training, but we don't do the kinds of things that you really need to do if you're going to prepare a country for war. So there's a lot more that you could do. And I think in the Taiwanese case, the more you do, the more they are likely to do.
I wondered, kind of conversely to what my last question is, what effect seeing the Russian army not be as strong as Putin thought it was in Ukraine in the beginning has had on Xi and his belief that the Chinese military is as strong as he might think it is.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I don't know. I'm not sure anybody does. I think, bear in mind, both Russia and China have somewhat racist views of one another. And I suspect that the Chinese are disdainful of the Russians. And so Xi may have more confidence in his own military. On the other hand, the fact that he's been purging them left and right, including the head of their strategic rocket forces, tells you that he may not have full confidence in them. I think there's probably something sobering in watching what the Chinese seem to have thought would be a kind of a very quick campaign turn into something much, much longer and bloodier. So it may have induced a certain amount of caution. But, any leader of a country, particularly a great country, operates in some sort of informational bubble. I mean, that's clearly true of President Biden right now. It's true of any American president. It's a much worse problem if it's a dictatorship of either the Putin or the Xi variety. So we don't really know what information he's getting and how he's processing it.
One other point you bring up in your piece is that essentially you say, Donald Trump picked Vance to support his views, not, picking Vance to support his vice president's views, that Vance won't have the influence that maybe many ascribe to him now that he is the vice president. Just to be devil's advocate, isn't the concern perhaps that he'll be the last person in many decisions to speak to Trump, and it's usually that last person that influences him?
So the first thing about Vance is this guy's an opportunist. This guy is unprincipled. If you look at his stands on Trump, the somersault that he has done, it's contemptible to begin with, but it just tells you something about who he really is. If he's told not to be an isolationist, I guarantee you he will stop being an isolationist. Secondly, at the moment, of course, they're riding high, and I think Trump likes that. Inevitably, what's going to happen in a Trump second term is people will begin talking about Vance as the kind of the crown prince who's the heir to MAGA. Trump will not like that. Trump's family will not like that. I mean, I think, Don Jr., among others, have begun to think of the presidency as one of the Trump family businesses. So, and there'll be a lot of people eager to cut him down to size, including quite possibly Trump. And let's remember what it's like to work for Donald Trump. Sooner or later, it involves humiliation and betrayal. And I'm quite sure that'll happen eventually to Vance, who, to protect himself, and I think because it's in his nature, will abase himself as much as is necessary, as he thinks is necessary. Some vice presidents are very influential and some are not. We've gotten used to the idea that, say, Dick Cheney was very influential. He was actually very influential in President Bush's first term, not so much in his second term. As I point out in the piece, let's remember Vance is the one who's going to be the neophyte to executive office. Trump is the one who's been there before, and the people around him have been there before in all likelihood. So I think the idea that he's really going to carry the day by force of his Yale Law School educated genius, I don't see that. Parenthetically, I will say is I would expect a fair amount of internal discord in this administration. They do not agree with each other on things like abortion. they don't really agree with each other on things like tariffs. There will be this contest for the succession, which Trump probably won't like, or if he does like it, he'll play them off against each other. They will, some of their policies, or particularly the economic policies, will produce in very short order consequences that'll be fairly ugly. And so the result is they're going to get consumed with internal fighting. Again, it gets to the heart of what I was saying at the beginning. I think if you reject Trump as thoroughly as I do, as a human being and as a leader, there's this terrible temptation to think a Trump administration would be this, smoothly running monolith, as well organized and executed as the Republican convention was. And it was very well run, very well executed, very well conceived. That's not what government is like. That's not, I mean, the convention you can control, and they did. Governance of the United States, you cannot control.
I think the piece does a very good job of painting why Donald Trump might not be cataclysmic. He wants to be seen as a winner, and I think you could probably make a similar case on the economy. He doesn't. He wants to end up as being viewed as a great president and winning for America. So he looks good. But you mentioned what I think, and I've always said it to me is where I think the problem will be. You write, the gravest concerns are domestic. Will Trump attempt to unleash the FBI and IRS on political opponents, or as he might think of them, enemies? Do you imagine, even if Trump turns out to be, okay to pretty good internationally, or okay to pretty good with the economy, that for most people it might be fine, but for people like General Milley or some of the people that he views as people, or General Kelly, that they may find themselves at the end of the FBI or an attorney general that he has put in place, that he will sic on them, that these people will be hounded during his presidency?
I think it's conceivable. And, there are a number of reasons why I remain, as I said, an unrepentant and unapologetic never Trumper. And that's one of him. And I will, however reluctantly, pull the lever for President Biden, who I think is at this point senescent, rather than have that. I guess one area in which I find myself diverging from some of my fellow conservatives, I think, and certainly a lot of liberals, I think the system is more resilient. I think the guardrails held. Now, some people say, well, barely, and I take that point, but I think they held. And I don't think he'll be able to suborn the courts. I think they may be able to purge some of the bureaucracy. I don't think they'll be able to purge all of it. And again, there will be life after Trump, and the people around him will be thinking about that from day one. This is the reason why most presidents' second terms are not particularly happy. Everybody around them has already begun thinking about what's the next thing. And particularly after the midterms, usually presidents get creamed in the midterms. Well, let's say, for example, worst case scenario, Biden refuses to step down. It's a slaughter in November, which it could well be, because he will drag down an awful lot of the ticket. By the time you get to 2026, he'll be out of the picture. You'll have, the Democrats will come roaring back. There'll be plenty of money to fund them. They will be energized, and you would have to expect that the Republicans will take some major, and they will have done stupid and dishonorable and possibly criminal things. And the Democrats will come roaring back. And then, everybody around Trump is going to be thinking, okay, how do I avoid jail? Because let's remember one thing. I am sure that a lot of the people around Trump have internalized what happened to the January 6th rioters, and will be thinking, yeah, maybe I could, we can throw Mark Milley in jail. And then what's going to happen when the Democrats come back and they come after me?
I wonder if you think there is a risk of all this, I'm not saying the word right, but of the doomsdayism, only seeing the worst case scenario. Some people on the never Trump right or on the left, seeing the end of democracy. Whereas, while that, I think you admit in this piece, there's the tail risk of that is the reason why you shouldn't vote for Trump.
Yeah.
But if you only see that and see his election as the end of the country, aren't you in some ways, if no one cooperates with him post-election, leading to a worst case scenario than trying to paint a bridge to a better scenario with Trump, trying to push him in a direction that would be less bad than just totally disengaging from him?
I don't know. The problem is I think people like me are basically powerless to exercise any influence over Trump. The people who can perhaps are the Tom Cottons and the Mike Pompeos and the Matt Pottingers and people like that, and I'll place my hopes in them. I think the more subtle danger is it gets in the way of people, particularly on the left, understanding why this guy is so popular. Now, some of it has to do with certain skills that he has. He has some narrow but very deep political skills. He's a showman. He has, like many would-be dictators, a kind of feral instinct for people's weaknesses and knows how to play on them. But there are other things at work here. And I think, thoughtful Democrats like Roy Teixeira, John Judas, have been warning for quite some time. Look, the Democratic Party kind of abandoned the working class. The left made a terrible mistake in endorsing a combination of grievance and identity politics. There's a reason, I think, why the Republican right really has rejected the old Republican elites, of which I suppose I was at least an honorary member. That sort of accounting can be delayed or distorted if you're spending all of your time whipping yourself into a frenzy thinking this is the end of the United States of America.
You mentioned that you think Joe Biden is, let's say, not quite the same person he was at least several years ago. In fact, you wrote a year ago in a column called "Step Aside, Joe. If history is any guide, an ailing and declining president does not simply say, 'You're right, Doc. Time for me to hand over the reins to the Veep.' Rather, as Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and others have done, they delay and deny, aided and abetted by families and close advisors who refuse to accept that reality." It seems that's exactly what is occurring now, if you believe some of the reports around Biden. He didn't obviously listen to you a year ago. He may finally listen. How do you think history will view his refusal to leave a year ago? Because even if he leaves now, it does seem he brought the Democratic Party to the brink of catastrophe. How will history view him for maybe selfishly staying on?
I think if he bails out now, he'll be viewed as a flawed and as what he is, sort of a decent mediocrity who nonetheless, rescued this country from a possible Trump second term in the 2020 election, and who was not a great president, but not a terrible president either. I think that he can still recover that if he stays to the end. And I would be quite harsh. I mean, I think he is senescent. He may unfortunately have some illness like Parkinson's. I'm not a doctor. I can't tell, but I've had close family members with Parkinson's, and it has that feel to me. Then his reputation will be awful. His reputation will be of a selfish, vain man who did terrible damage to this country and terrible damage, quite possibly, to the world by refusing to step aside and let a younger generation come forward. So what I'm hoping is that message is finally getting through to his family and his immediate advisors. I think, the way this looks to me is I think you have an orchestrated campaign led by some very competent people like Nancy Pelosi to apply more and more and more pressure on him. He is a notoriously stubborn and willful man, so this will be very hard. I think I have no idea what goes on in his family, but I think probably the most important thing will be if there's a moment where his wife, comes to realize the thing that I just said. That's the hope that he will step down. And for the sake of the country, and his sake, but frankly, I care more about the country. I absolutely hope that he will step down. I will say one other thing, which I think may help explain his reluctance to step down, but more importantly, the reluctance of the family to let him step down. Often, people who've had a life consumed by politics and by high office decline very fast once they retire. I mean, that was the story of LBJ, President Johnson. And I think it could be his story too. So they may be literally of the view that stepping down now would be a death sentence.
Professor, thank you for joining the Dispatch podcast.
My pleasure.